Alright, let's solve set matrix 0 problem on LeetCode. In this problem, we're given an integer array of size m times n. If an element is 0 within this matrix, then we need to set its entire row and column to zeros. So for example here, the element in the middle is a 0, so we need to replace all the values above it and below it, as well as left and right to it, to zeros, as you can see here. Here in example 2, we have two zeros located at the beginning top left and at the top right. So we need to change all the elements to the right of the first zero and below it, and similarly to the left of the second zero and all the elements below it. Okay, so the way we're going to solve this is by creating arrays of our own. These arrays are going to track the indices where a 0 is located in our original matrix, and then obviously we're going to loop through our original matrix to retrieve those indices, and then in a separate independent loop we're going to loop through the rows and columns of our matrix, and we're gonna replace the elements where our two arrays that we created that tracked where the zeros were. We're going to replace those positions with zeros. So it may sound a bit vague, but as we go along, it will begin to make sense. The first thing we want to do is we want to retrieve the number of elements, the number of rows and number of columns within our original matrix, because they may vary given m times n. So the way we're going to do that is simply we're going to create a integer variable called rows, which is equal to matrix.length. This will retrieve the number of rows we have in our matrix, and to get columns it's similar. We are going to call an integer variable calls for column. This is going to be equal to matrix at 0.length instead. This will get us the number of columns in our matrix. Now we need to create two independent arrays to track the indices where we find a 0 for rows and for columns. So now I'm going to create our two arrays which tracks where we have our zeros in which row and which column. And I'm going to make these Boolean arrays called 0 rows. These are the rows which we need to 0, new Boolean, and it's going to have a size of rows, and Boolean 0 calls equals new Boolean with a size of calls. So what we're doing here is within these two arrays, when we loop through our matrix and we find a 0, we're going to store within these two arrays the row in which we located the 0 and the column in which we located the 0. So for example here, we have a 0 at 1, 1, so 0 rows is going to contain 1 and 0 columns is going to contain 1. In the second example, top left, top right, our 0 rows is going to store 0 and then 1, 2, 3, so 0 and 3, and then our 0 calls is going to store 0 and 0. So now let's actually store our 0 rows and 0 columns. So we need a nested for loop here, so we can loop through every element in our matrix for int I equals to 0 as long as I is less than matrix.length I plus plus. Instead of matrix.length, we already called it rows, so let's just do that. And then for int j equals to 0 as long as j is less than calls j plus plus. Now we're going to check if our matrix array at index I and j is equal to 0, and if that's the case, I need to remove this. If that's the case, then we need to store the indices of I and j in the two arrays that we created. So 0 rows at I is going to be equal to true, and then 0 calls at j is going to be equal to true. Now we can exit our for loop, and actually what we need to do is update the values that we need to update. So finally what we're going to do is we're going to iterate through the rows and columns in our matrix. So for int I again equals to 0 as long as I is less than rows, I++. Similarly, for int j equals to 0, as long as j is less than columns, j++. Now what we want to check is if 0 rows at I or 0 columns at j, if one of these are equal to true, not necessarily both, if one of these are equal to true, then we need to update our matrix at I and j to be equal to 0. And that's it. We don't need to return anything because it's a void method, but I would like to go through the code once again to make sure everything is clear. So the first thing we do is we're going to store the number of rows in our matrix and the number of columns. So in example 1, we have int rows equal to matrix.length. So int rows is equal to 3, and so is columns is equal to 3. The number of columns is equal to 3. I think I just noticed that I've been calling these rows and these columns. I don't know why, I just noticed, but obviously it's the other way. So we have 3 rows and 3 columns. Next, we're going to create 2 Boolean arrays called 0 rows and 0 columns. Then we create 2 Boolean arrays, 0 rows and 0 columns. 0 rows has a size of rows, so since we have 3 rows, it's going to store 3 elements. Similarly, 0 columns, size of columns, which is 3, so it also stores 3 elements. And what we're going to do is we're going to loop through our original matrix, and we're going to check at each index, so at 0, 0, at 0, 1, at 0, 2, at 1, 0, 1, 1, 1, 2, and then 2, 0, 2, 1, 2, 2. We're checking all the elements within our original array. And every time we stumble onto a 0, so for example here at 1, 1, we're going to store in 0 rows and 0 columns at index I, wherever the 0 appears. So here it appears at 1. We're going to store true. And then similarly for the 0 column, wherever or whichever column stores the 0, whichever index that is, we're going to store in 0 column at that index as well, true. Now in Java, automatically all the other elements in our array are going to be set to false. So basically in example 1, we'd have a boolean 0 rows which contains the values false, true, false, and the 0 column array is going to store again false, true, false. So once again, we're going to loop through our original matrix, and if 0 rows at I, if the index or if the element which we're on in our original matrix, so if the index in our original matrix in our 0 rows array is true, contains a value of true, or the same thing but for 0 columns array, then we're going to update the index I and j to be equal to 0. So for example, we start at 0, 0, which is right here. Okay, if 0 rows at 0 is true, is that the case? No, remember it's false, true, false. Okay, what about 0 columns? Also, it's false, true, false. So nothing happens. Then we're going to increment j to 1. So now we're going to be here. And this, we're looking at this column now. Okay, is 0 rows at 0 true? Once again, no, it's not. Is 0 columns at 1 true? Yes, it is. So we're going to update matrix at 0, 1 to be 0, which is the element my cursor is on. And then we're going to increment j again to 2, but this time 0 rows at 0 is still false, and 0 columns at 2 is false, so nothing happens. And then finally we increment I, so now I is down here, we're now looking here. Okay, is 0 rows at I at 1 true? Yes, it is. So immediately this value here is now a 0. And then we increment j. So I is 1, j is 1 as well. So now we're here, but this is already a 0, so we're going to overwrite it to be a 0 anyways. And then finally here, 0 rows at 1 is true, so this will also be a 0. And then finally we increment I one more time, so I is now 2, which is down here. Is 0 rows at 2 true? It's not, it's false. Is 0 columns at 0 true? It's not, it's false, so we're going to skip this. This is going to be true since 0 columns at 1 is true, and then the final element we're gonna skip. So let's submit our code and see if it works. Oh, small error. This is supposed to be equals, not equal. We're not checking, we're not comparing anything. We're reassigning a value. We're overwriting a value. It's not a condition, so just fix that. Let's submit again, and there we go. So that was the set matrix zeros problem on LeetCode. I understand the explanation in the beginning was a little vague, but if you go through with the video and you watch through the example, I hope you understand what we did. So that was the set matrix zero problem once again on LeetCode. I hope you found that video helpful, and thanks for watching.